Hello, and welcome to TraumaBytes. We have put together another edition of our program on trauma performance improvement. Keep it simple. Today's session is on loop closure and report writing. This series is brought to you by AMN Healthcare Revenue Cycle Solutions. I am Susan Schmunk and will be serving as your facilitator for this conversation with Christy Carroll. Together, we bring 35 years of trauma experience to the table. If you are interested in further information on either of us, I will be sharing our biographies at the end of this session. In previous podcasts, we have explored National Trauma Data Standard, or NTDS, complications and their impact on patient care, audit filters and the optimization of your data, driving measurable improvement through performance improvement or PI tools, and lastly, corrective action plan. Our objectives for this session are to define loop closure or event resolution, recognize steps leading to loop closure, describe report writing and its relationship with loop closure, check your progress. Did your corrective action plan meet its objectives? Recognize common reasons for failed event resolution and how to move forward. Hello, Christy. It's so nice to have you back for this episode. I would like to start with asking you to provide us an overview on loop closure and report writing. Then we'll get to some more specific details.
Hi, Sue. Thanks for having me back. It's good to be here. Um, so, you want me to define loop closure or event resolution? Well, loop closure or event resolution is essentially assuring that the opportunity that you identified for improvement has actually been fixed and providing that documentation to prove it. It really involves a cycle of monitoring, fixing, and monitoring again. So in that ongoing monitoring, you're able to identify issues that come up or problems along the way that you can then address and fix to assure that you stay on goal. Um, keep in mind that failure to document resolution or identification of continued resolution deficiency may result in repeat errors, patient harm, and even site survey deficiency. So that's really key to make sure you close out that loop.
That sounds really good, but let's delve a little bit deeper into this and talk about how that event resolution, what it's guided by.
That's a really good point. Uh, so, event resolution is really guided by several factors. Uh, the main one being focusing on the endpoint and not just the plan. If you focus on only the plan, you're never going to reach that goal. You've got to have that target in mind. You also need to focus on when the event resolved. So, when is it that this event is resolved and when is it going to be resolved? So, you need to have a reasonable time frame. Some things can be resolved, with one intervention and it's one and done. Other things could take months or even years to resolve. So when you're looking at bigger organizational things that you're trying to resolve, say uh, equipment, something as large as a CT scan or MRI, or even a certain type of transfusion warming pump and the equipment to go with it and the training that goes with it, sometimes that can actually take years. It's a big process. So, really having that reasonable goal in mind is good. And sometimes that goal is driven with it by and with input from your administration and from your purchasing department, and from your nurse educators and others that are involved who can help you kind of guide that time frame. And it's also important that you use the best reporting to use to represent that resolution. So that's we're talking charts and graphs or maybe a written report. Depends on kind of who your audience is and what you're needing to tell them. You also need to focus on how the documentation and information is reported and to whom. So like I said, depending on what your audience is, who your audience is, that's going to kind of drive that presentation. You need to keep in mind who makes the final decision on successful event resolution as well. It could be that it is your trauma program manager. It could be that it's your hospital administration. It could even be that it's the American College of Surgeons when they come to do a site visit. So keep in mind, again, that's your target audience of who you're telling this event is resolved. And then adding comments to your loop closure that say wording similar to future similar patients are less likely to have this problem because, and that actually comes from Dr. Bonta back in 2017. That was the best way that they felt it was a good way to represent how you can prove, okay, we're done and this is why and this is how.
Yes, we all have familiarity with the American College of Surgeons and or the ACS and how they drive our processes. So there are a couple, or there's one major resource. Give us a little bit of information on that.
Sure. So all of us being familiar with the American College of Surgeons are, of course, going to be familiar with the resources for optimal care of the injured patient. So that is our trauma survey Bible. It is what guides what we do. And in there, they're actually very clear and say, problem resolution, outcome improvements, and assurance of safety are considered part of that loop closure, and they must readily be identifiable through methods of monitoring, reevaluation, benchmarking, and documentation. That's actually found on page 115 in what is now the Orange Book. But it's all right there. Then when you identify the problem, resolve the problem, show those improvements, and document those improvements, and be able to compare previous data to current data in order to show what you've done.
And so to bring that back around, let's just talk for a minute about when is loop closure necessary?
Sure. So loop closure is necessary when you've identified an opportunity to improve, you've taken actions to prevent similar future occurrences, and you need to prove it. So it's the final step in that process of your corrective action plan. If you don't have that loop closure, your corrective action plan is not complete.
Christy, I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss this with us and give us kind of a blow by blow description. And let's move on for a minute to talking about identifying the steps that you need to take or enact for loop closure.
Sure, Sue. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit before, but it's important to remember that repetition is what helps it sink in. It's in order to assure that loop closure, you've really got to look at your whole corrective action plan and kind of work through it step by step. So you've identified that issue and you've done the analysis of the current state of the event and shown the levels of review. So you've identified it, you've said, this is the problem we've identified. The TMD assigned a level of review to it of potential harm, for example. And then you put that action plan for the issue into that component. So you have to have that plan of action. What am I going to do? And then what steps you're going to take to resolve it. And once it's resolved, you document that loop closure and you provide whatever data, whatever metric, whatever chart, whatever write-up goes with that, and then also include all actions and documentation in your software. So whatever program you're using to do this in, whether it be your trauma database, a different PI software, it's all got to be there. And you attach all related emails, documents. Say you developed a practice guideline. All of those things go in there so that you can then show this is all of the work that we did. And really, just like when you're, for example, doing a math problem in school, you want to show all your work or you don't get full credit. It's kind of that same idea. You want to prove all of your work so that if there's ever a question about, well, did you do this? Did you actually resolve it? You can go back and show that you did. And then once an event is resolved, there is some ongoing monitoring steps that have to happen. And they could include, monitoring the factors that led to the event that have been corrected. So did we have a recurrence of those factors? It also could be ensuring corrective measures that were taken are effective. So, you might report out ongoing monitoring to, say, your trauma systems or to your trauma process improvement committee or to even to hospital administration about, okay, we put these things in place and we're monitoring these every quarter and reporting them out to you to assure that we have sustained change.
Christy, I like the idea of having it all in one place. We all know we get busy and, this piece of information might be in one source, that piece of information might be in another source. But again, we know when the American College of Surgeons comes, they want, boom, here's everything. And so putting that together beforehand and making sure it's all cohesive and you can get from the problem to the resolution and not have to say, just a minute, let me get this notebook. Let me go here for that information is key to a lot of this. So talking about data, metrics, let's go to something that a lot of people dread. Um, let's talk about report writing and how that ties into loop closure.
Absolutely. Yes, dreaded report writing, especially when you can't make your program show you what you want it to show you. It can be really tricky. Um, but report writing is super important. So it's really dependent on a couple of things. Accurate data capture is by far the most important thing. So garbage into a database equals garbage out. So whatever format you're using to collect this data, the data that's put in needs to be accurate. Um, if you have different types of data to report, and there's a lot of different ways you can represent this information. So sometimes it could be in, say, a quality or compliance report. These are really common. This is kind of your proofs that you are compliant. It shows event occurrence compliance guideline, so guidelines, those kinds of things. Um, and that report can come in the form of all sorts of different kinds of bars or graphs, but it may not just be one type. It could be multiple. You have education documentation. So this may be your sign-in sheets from educational offerings and your outline and your goals for that educational offering. And if you have, a post test to prove that people had understanding, it's that all that component that goes into it, or course evaluations that then get submitted. Those are all the kinds of things that you want to just scan into a big file and have sitting in that pot for when surveyors come. You have to show the data clearly, though. So there's different kinds of graphs and charts that can be helpful. So if you're wanting to look at things like trends over time, so say we're looking at our volume over time. You might want to use a line graph. If you're wanting to compare years even, you could break it down into line graphs for this year, the previous year, and the next year, and show your volume comparatively by month with a line graph. Um, Bar graphs, they're really good for comparison of before and after. So here's the data before our intervention, and here's the data after our intervention. And the bars could be two different colors, and they can see clearly, green is good, red was bad. It's a very visual representation. A pie chart is really good for showing the percentages of parts of a whole. So how many percentage of our trauma activations were our mid-level activations versus our highest level of activation. That's a good, just really quick visual representation of that. A spreadsheet, these can be a little tricky. It simulates a worksheet and it displays everything as a grid. It can contain formulas that help to calculate the data. It's not really good for presenting information because it's really busy, but it's a really good place to start. And that's how kind of you can generate those charts and graphs. Let's see, we've got a bell curve. A bell curve, it visually demonstrates standard deviations from the normal to the average. And, just like with grades, you have that bell curve of this portion fell out on the low end, this portion fell out on the high end, and this is the average. So that can be useful depending on what type of information you're trying to present. You may have statistical control charts. So these are a really good way to show compliance or change over time. So say you're wanting to show your DVT rate in your hospital over the last 6 years. You can look month by month and see your average. And then you can also calculate the standard deviation, or even have the program calculate the standard deviation and see where your outliers are and see if you have had a spike or a drop unexpectedly that is sustained for more than 2 months or so. And so you can really hone in on that data, but you can really show your compliance with that as well. Then you've got things like Pareto charts that show data from the most to the least frequently occurring from left to right. So these are used to clearly identify higher valued items. It can help to set priority for resolution of issues. So if you're in committee and you say, okay, guys, what do we want to focus on? It's really easy to say, well, these are our biggest problems. Scattergrams. These display only 2 variables. So that's only helpful if you're looking at 2 things. Anything more than that, it's not very helpful at all. A dashboard. This is a good way to take information to your working team. So say you have a subcommittee that is working on your corrective action plan. That dashboard helps to keep everybody on track because you can see what's already accomplished and what still needs to be done, and discuss issues along the way. So that is a very helpful tool. And then benchmark reports. Anybody who's familiar with TQIP and benchmarking they know what these are. And these could be really helpful to see if you are an outlier, if you've improved, if you've gotten worse. Hopefully that's not the case with your solutions and your corrective action plan. But benchmark reports can be very helpful, especially when looking at similar centers. They can also help to drive that portion of your analysis to say, how can we do this better? Let's look at what other centers like us are doing, and then implement some changes and be able to show, hey, look, we've improved. So all of those kinds of reports are helpful. That's certainly not the only a comprehensive list of what's available, but those are just some of the basics that we use when we're looking at report writing and trying to pull that into loop closure to show that we have had our improvement that we were expecting.
That's a nice overview on those particular how to present data. I like that. But give us an insight on just over all of them. What's the most important part in any graph or chart?
Sure. There are some key components to any graph or chart that you just have to have in order for it to make it a usable and valuable set of data. And most importantly, keep it simple and present only the essential information. You don't want to have any extra information in there that could be confusing or to distract from the data that you're trying to present. So keep it simple. Title the graph clearly to show its purpose. So you want your graph, if you're looking at improving timeliness of trauma physician uh, arrival in trauma bay for level 1 or your highest level of traumas, title it that way. Maybe something shorter, but I mean, you want it to be very clear. This is what we're looking at. And then include your N, or your total number of cases that you're including. So give people enough data so that when they look at it, they're looking at the volume. That's your whole volume of the charts or the incidences that you are looking at. If you have an N that's very small, of say 5, you're not necessarily going to be showing great improvement as your post evaluation if your N from your starting data was 5,000. So really you need to be presenting good data, and that N helps to show them what you're looking at. Specify units of measurements on your X and Y axis. So, throw in that little label that says months and volume or whatever it is you're looking at. And then label each part of your graph. You may need a legend if there are large number of labels, or if you're using a pie graph, for example. and you've got more that even with just two areas in a pie graph, you want to be able to identify and label each one of those so people clearly know what they're looking at. And definitely use different colors. Try to stay away from the black and the white and the grayscale. It just kind of takes away from the chart. You really want to be able to identify easily what is what, and you use positive colors for your positives. I had mentioned earlier red and green. Red is bad, green is good. Um, Yellow is somewhere in the middle. But use colors that represent commonly known things to kind of pull that out and pull the eye to them. And then it's bringing that all together and presenting it to your PI committee or to hospital admin. And if there's questions from them, you better know your data so you can speak to it.
Well, it makes you think about practicing your presentation in front of people that not only understand what you're trying to present, but those that don't understand the jargon that we use and need further explanation.
That is a really good point. And as a matter of fact, before I presented any data, I would always take it to my trauma program manager, my TMD, or to somebody else within my team and say, look at this. What does it tell you? Because you really do want to make sure that people understand what you're telling them. So it's always okay to have a second set of eyes on it.
Let's move on to talking about identifying how to know if your corrective action plan met the objectives.
Yes, this is a really important part of that loop closure. So you need to know if your corrective action plan met objectives, and you do that by looking to and asking these questions. So were each of the goals addressed and closed successfully? If you have an outstanding goal that was not closed successfully, and there's a good reason for it, just document it. Document it, document it, document it. If it is still open and in progress, continue documenting. Um, you also want to know, what does your data show? Does it show that improvement you were looking for? Did it show the improvement in a way that you expected it to? Maybe it was more effective than you had expected it to be. That's always our goal, right? Um, and then in addition to that, does your documentation show closure? So does it have all of the pieces? Does it have all of those emails? Does it have the guideline that was created? Does it have the charts? You've got to assure that it shows full closure of every one of your action items.
So obviously attention to detail is a great positive thing to have in your wheelhouse if you're the one doing this.
Very much.
Let's talk a little bit about documentation of loop closure.
All right. So documentation of loop closure, I know this is kind of our end goal here. Um, there's a lot of different ways to document loop closure, but really the more standard you can get it in your format, the better, because then you're going to be approaching it from the same view every time. So like we'd mentioned before, that template of, in the future, similar patients are less likely to have this problem because of these actions. And then you list out those actions. Uh, Really is kind of the gold standard. And you want to be able to describe what has already been done. So this is important for, say it's the middle of a survey year and you have surveyors coming. They want to know what you have done to work towards that goal and what you have done to complete that goal. Um, you also kind of want to look at all of your reviewed cases to make sure that that loop closure has actually been documented on every case that was reviewed that had an action plan. And really, even this ties over into just your typical uh, process improvement activities. You want to have a closure, a statement of, this is closed because it just wraps everything up nicely. We like to say it, wrap it up with a bow. or make it pretty for surveyors, but give them a package that says, here you go, it's done. Um, Loop closure is important to include those supporting documents. I've said this before, and I can't stress this enough. Any little document, any email, meeting minutes, responses from queries, all of those are included. If you, even those little, hey, data analyst, can you pull this data for me so I can kind of see where we are? Include those in there so you can show that working process to surveyors or hospital admin or whoever it is that you're showing this to, so that they can see the work that you have done and that has gone into this. So just as an example, so one of the facilities I worked in, we had a trauma surgeon who was routinely documented as late to the trauma bay for our highest levels of activation. Now, the data was captured in your trauma database or in the trauma database, and it was reported out monthly. So during our PI meetings, he would see his response times going down, and he would say, "That's not true. I know that's not true. I was there." We said, "Well, let's look at the process. But because you've dropped below a certain percentage, now it becomes an issue we have to deal with before the surveyors come." And so the trauma program manager met with the surgeon. They discussed what was going on. The surgeon made the decision with the trauma program manager that he would present himself to the scribe nurse every time he walked in the trauma bay and said, "I am Dr. So-and-so. Please write down that I am here and present prior to arrival at, whatever time it was." And he would watch the nurse write it down. We also did some education with the nursing staff to let them know, not just for this physician, but for all of the physicians. If you don't know who the trauma surgeon is, you better ask. So we did education and on the identification of the trauma surgeon and the documentation. And then we started looking at our data again, and we tracked it for several weeks and then several months. And what we were able to show was a change. So in that loop closure, not only did we show that, hey, timeliness improved because we did X, Y, and Z, but we have the documentation to support when that meeting happened, when that email went out to staff, when it was followed up with observations with staff, when the TPM went down and actually met with the educator, and then how that data was being written down and captured and it was observed, and all of those things. We included all of that into that report so that when surveyors came, that was actually something that we pulled out and we said, hey, 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 look, we identified a problem when we fixed it. And that was that was a good thing. They looked at it and went, yes, that's exactly what we want to see. Um, and we kind of felt good about it ourselves because we caught it in advance, we fixed it, and we had a way to prove that we did it, and it was sustained. And honestly, we never had a problem with that surgeon again. So, and documentation improved, which was great because that showed better for all of our other surgeons as well.
That's a nice example, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. And let's go on to talk a little bit about we've kind of, I think done this over and over again here. We've talked about what loop closure includes, and that's driven by documentation over and over and over again. So having good documentation is key to the whole process. Having data, and let's talk a little bit about data and maybe the need to tweak data points to uncover the documentation or uncover the um, the elements you need to prove loop closure.
Sure. So one thing in your data capture, in order to assure that loop closure is accurate, is whenever you have an outlier or something that you're looking at data wise, you always want to ask, is this real? Is this data correct? And so that, you rely heavily on your data abstractors or your nurse abstractors, whoever is pulling that information. And sometimes the question starts with, where is this data coming from? Why are we pulling it from there? Is there a better way to capture that data? And sometimes it's as simple as that. And you can identify that problem right up front and say, oh, everybody's been capturing the data from here, but really, that's not the most accurate point to capture this data. So um, let's look at capturing it from this place. And especially as more and more hospitals have implemented electronic medical records, there's a timestamp on everything. Uh, it really makes a difference sometimes in how data is captured. And so you can use that data or that process to drive the analysis of where that data is coming from and then be able to look and see what your actual data is. And when you do that, you may find you have actually no problem, or you may find your problem is bigger than you thought. Um, but in either case, it can drive forward those steps a little bit more clearly. Um, did that did that cover what you asked, Kat?
Well, really, it did. And this documents how some of those tweaks, some of those changes we have to make are kind of low-hanging fruit, if you will. If we change where we capture the data, if we fine-tune what we're doing, then the data improves. And data is the life of a trauma team because it's the only way to prove and get the metrics that can show sustained change over time.
That's very true. Trauma programs absolutely are data driven, and so are hospitals. And really, anytime you want to see improvement, it should be data driven.
Yeah, it is nice to have those numbers to back everything up.
Very much.
All right. Well, Christy, thank you for spending time with us today. And I want to close today's session with the thought that the overarching goal is eliminating complications to improve the care of each and every patient. Please go to the website to complete the survey and obtain your CEUs. We would also appreciate your questions for future podcasts. You may email us at TraumaBytes. The email address appears at the bottom of your screen. As I mentioned, I will continue with the bios on Christy and myself. Christy Carroll, BSN, RN, TCRN, is currently working as a trauma registrar and process improvement specialist with AMN. She was formerly a trauma program coordinator for an ACS, or American College of Surgeons, verified level 1 adult and level 2 pediatric combined trauma center in Southern California. She also has worked as a trauma registrar, trauma process improvement nurse, as well as injury prevention coordinator. She has over 20 years of experience in nursing, with 19 of those being in trauma. She has spoken at many community events and trauma conferences throughout Orange County, California, and has presented research at the Eastern Association for the Surgery of Trauma. Susan Schmunk, CAISS-CSTR, is both a trauma subject matter expert and a client consultant registrar for AMN RCS. Her background is varied, but has been focused on trauma for the last 15 years. Starting out as a trauma registrar at her local ACS Level 1 verified adult and Level 2 verified pediatric hospital, she was nominated for and selected as the Sherry Zalgrass Scholarship winner for the American Trauma Society in 2010. Later that year, she went on to complete the distance learning course for trauma registrars offered by the ATS. This quest for knowledge led her to become a certified specialist in trauma registry in 2014, with recertification in 2018, followed by attaining the title of Certified Abbreviated Injury Scoring Specialist, or CAISS, in 2015 and recertifying in 2021. Most recently, she has focused on the area of autopsy reports and their significance to the trauma registry. This led to a presentation at the 2018 National Association of Medical Examiners, or NAME, meeting as part of a physician-led panel of medical examiners on the vital role of medical examiners and autopsy data in trauma system development. An outgrowth of this presentation was co-authoring an invited presentation at the 2018 TQIP, or Trauma Quality Improvement Program, annual meeting entitled Using Autopsy Data to Improve Care. She is currently involved at the national level with NAME and chair of the Ad Hoc Committee on Trauma. We'd like to thank you for your time spent with us today and ask you to please send any ideas you have for future talks and or questions to TraumaBytes.